Professor Frank Keller from the University of Edinburgh. Frank started out his career here at the IMS in Stuttgart as one of the handful of diploma students of computational linguistics, and then went to Edinburgh for his PhD and later became a full professor there. His research has always been on the interface of NLP and cognitive science. In the early years, it was more focusing on grammaticalization, syntactic structure, and other topics. And in more than the past decade now, he has focused on two main research areas, and that's language and vision models and computational narrative models. And the talk, I guess, is somehow combining the two topics. In any case, we're looking forward to Frank talking about grounding across modalities and domains.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and it's great to be here again. I actually looked it up. My last talk here was exactly 10 years ago in 2015, so a lot has happened since then, but it's good to be back. And I'm actually quite commonly in the Stuttgart area because I have relatives nearby. So anyway, so today I'm going to talk about grounding, and I'll explain in a moment what I mean by grounding. And then I will dive into two applications of grounding. There's no cognitive science. I mean, I still do a bit of cognitive science, but not today. The first application is on visual storytelling, which, as Sabine says, combines narrative and grounding, or language and vision more precisely. And the second one is slightly more applied, is on understanding instructional videos, and basically generating a simple semantic representation for those videos, predicting the next step in the instructions, and so on. Okay, and yes, I would be amiss if I didn't mention that this is really the work of two PhD students, Danya Yu and Anil Batra, and then there's a bunch of faculty collaborators as well who contribute advice and so on. But it's really the students' work. So first part is Danyang's and second part is Anil's. Okay, so you might be wondering, what is grounding? And people use this term in a bunch of different ways. I will use it in a very specific way of linking, in a multimodal input, linking the visual and the linguistic part of the input. So I'll try to see if at least the pointer works. So more generally, we're relating linguistic expressions. This could be names. This could be referring expressions to non-linguistic entities in the context. And this could, of course, be visual. So, for example, image regions. People have been doing this for 10 years, trying to link referential expression to image regions. It could be something more elaborate in videos. In videos, you also have temporal grounding, right? You need to find the point in the video that is being referred to in the text. But it could be something completely different, and I won't talk about this again, but it could be SQL queries, where you have a question in natural language and you ground this into a SQL query that actually implements that question against the database. Or if you think in terms of programming and executable code, of course, in that domain, you have a lot of comments. You have natural language descriptions of what the code does. So that's also a form of grounding. You ground the language into something executable. Okay, so here, and this is the animations don't quite work now. Okay. Here we will focus on visual grounding, meaning a linguistic phrase is grounded into a region of a video or an image. Okay, best to illustrate this with an example. So here we have a little text. This is actually from the visual narrative corpus, which is one of the standard data sets in the area. Let me just quickly read it out. So two small boys are sitting on a white mat. A boy is crying, and he's wearing a yellow t-shirt and gray shorts. The other boy is wearing a white t-shirt and cream shorts, and is holding an object in his hand. So what we can see here is that there's quite a lot of referring expressions. I've picked out two, one boy and the other boy. So we're establishing reference to two boys. There's other stuff. There's the shorts that they're wearing. There is an object in his hand, and so on. Here, let's focus on person reference, and you'll see in a moment why. So there's these two boys. These are references to persons. And we can ground those by linking them to images. So here's an image, cute toddlers, always good to have in a talk. So, and we can link those just by drawing bounding boxes. So in computer vision, people normally draw bounding boxes when they identify objects. Sometimes they do segmentation masks, I'll come back to that. But here we've just drawn bounding boxes, and the green bounding box belongs to the other boy. How do we know this? Well, because he's wearing a white t-shirt, right? And the other one is wearing a yellow t-shirt. And so the green box is the other boy, and the red box is the first boy being mentioned. They don't have any names or anything like that. But we see that there's other stuff going on. We have anaphora as well, right? Here the text says one boy is crying, he's wearing a yellow t-shirt, and the other boy, there's two other pronouns referring to that boy. So our grounding task just has become a little bit more complicated because now we want to ground a chain of reference, right? So here, for example, the green chain is grounded in this region, and the red chain is grounded in this referring expression and this pronoun. So it's become the task of not just taking an expression and finding a visual region, but also matching co-referring expressions. They should refer to the same region. And this can become quite complicated. And I can refer to Donald Trump as Donald, the president, the commander-in-chief, and so on. And they're all the same referring expression. Different referring expressions referring to the same object. Okay, now of course you're asking, well, LLMs can do this already, right? So any paper we're writing in NLP has to first check whether ChatGPT can already do it, or your other favorite model. We are actually using Quen quite a lot in my lab, but okay. So here's an example. This is a clock. This is actually a clock of Big Ben, in case you're interested. And you ask the LLM, what's the time on the clock? And this is the answer. The time on the clock appears to be approximately 2:10. The hour, and that is wrong, of course, but there's an explanation as well. The hour hand is slightly past 2, no. And the minute hand is pointing just past 2 on the outer ring. So they're pointing on the same thing? No. So it is identifying the 10-minute mark correctly, but of course not correctly in respect to the image. And this actually is a systematic observation. And this is one of my students, Rohit Saxena, who just published a paper at a Neurips workshop about this. So he has created a whole data set of clocks and calendars as well. And it turns out most of the LLMs, most of the time, cannot read clocks or calendars. And of course, it's a grounding problem, right? You need to relate the text to the image. So there's already evidence that LLMs maybe are not so good at that. Here's another fun example. I've given this to GPT 4.0, and I've asked it to circle all the vowels in this sign. So again, a grounding problem, right? You need to understand the image, you need to find the vowels, you need to draw little boxes or circles around them. And it sort of works. So it found some vowels, but it's also very fond of T's. Of course, there's a lot of T's. And of course, it missed lots of vowels. Here and so on. So another piece of evidence that maybe LLMs cannot do this task already, at least not all the time. More examples. You can ask it to draw a map of Germany and label the federal states. It's very surprising how big Bremen is on that map, for example. So I don't have this example. And there's 2 Thüringens. Anyway, I don't have this example here, but I could go on. Something slightly more relevant to this talk. So here is a sequence from a video where we've taken, this is an instructional video, cooking video. We've just taken 4 frames out of that video. As you can see, in the first 2 frames, someone is cooking a flatbread or a pita bread or something like that. And in the in the last 2 frames, they're cutting it up. So maybe VLMs can do, or LLMs can do video understanding. So I asked it to describe the sequence in 1 sentence. If you don't say 1 sentence and you get a whole story, And as we know, some of the LLMs are really wordy, but here it's just one sentence, and it says, this sequence shows the process of cooking a flatbread in a skillet. Okay, so far so good. Flipping it, can't really see the flipping, but let's assume. And then placing it on a surface to cool and prepare it for further steps. So this is sort of correct, except it's missing something crucial, right? Because the cook here is cutting the pita bread. You can see the knife, you can see the pieces afterwards, and so on. So as humans, this is obviously trivial for us to figure out, but maybe LLMs are not so good at action recognition, which is what computer vision people would call this task. Right? You look at video, you figure out the actions that are being depicted. So, and if we're dealing in the instructional domain, then that, of course, is a problem because we'll have lots of actions. Okay, so back to grounding. So I hopefully I have convinced you, I've told you what grounding is, I've convinced you a little bit that LLMs can't do this task already, but what could we use it for? So the hypothesis I will propose here is that grounding is useful for a bunch of tasks that involve visual and linguistic information. So for example, image generation. Right, so the example I mentioned where we asked the model to draw a map, that's an image generation task. Image captioning, which is the opposite task. You have an image and you describe what's going on. Visual storytelling, we'll come to that. This is the next part of the talk. Visual storytelling is something more sophisticated than image description because it relates to multiple images and you're supposed to generate a coherent story, not just a simple description. And then video description, for example, in the instructional domain. And I'll focus on the last two tasks, visual storytelling and video description. Okay, so this is part one on visual storytelling. First of all, what's the task here? So let me try to explain how it's different from video description. So in this task, we have a sequence of images. As you can see, this is from a children's birthday. You see quite a lot of characters. You see the cake, then the gifts are being unwrapped and so on. So there's clearly, there's a sequence here. And this is actually from a standard data set in the area called the VIST, Visual Storytelling Data Set. And this data set contains images. There are always five images, just been designed that way, and then a simple story. So in this case, it's something like that. It is Ella's 11th birthday, and the family is all over. No, the family is all there to celebrate. Ella looks at her cake, waiting for the chance to blow out the candles. After she's blown them out, she cuts the cake, and so on. So you can see the stuff going on that I was talking about, right? There's referring expressions like Ella or the family. There is pronominal reference as well. Her brother, for example, she cuts the cake. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on in terms of grounding. And now we have the additional problem that we have a sequence of images. So we need to find out whether this girl is the same as that girl, is the same as that girl. Right? If we don't want to do the grounding properly, then we don't want another expression for this girl. Right? If it's the same person depicted multiple times. There's also slightly more problematic stuff like the family. That clearly refers to a group, but which group? Okay, so things have become a little bit more complicated. The way we're going to solve this task is basically by first finding the regions in the image. So here I've not drawn bounding boxes. I've drawn what's called segmentation masks, which are tight-fitting masks around the object. And here, conveniently, we have already identified that this person is the same as that person is the same as that person. We've added a little number to indicate this. We've also used the same color. And then in the text, we've also identified all instances of Ella and pronouns referring to her, and also linked this to region 4 in the image. Okay, and then we've also dealt with more complicated expressions like the family here and said this is everyone, person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Because there's actually 3 more people here, then there's a 5th person here, and yeah, this person must be the mother, it's barely visible. And there's even more complicated stuff like ELLIS 2 younger siblings, which we assume is entity 2 and 5. Okay, now we have a fully grounded story. And the hypothesis now will be, if we do the grounding first, then we can generate better stories than if we don't ground. And that's what I'm hoping to show. Now, the problem is, of course, this is nice, but how do we get this annotation, right? This is a lot of hard work for people to annotate. And we have actually created a small hand-annotated set, a subset of the VIS data set that has this annotation, but it doesn't really scale. And so I will now propose an automated way of getting this annotation, which we then can use to train a model. And this is where our LLMs come back, right? Because we can actually get LLMs to output this grounding information quite nicely, even though they cannot do it in one go. If you input this into an LLM, they will not be able to output this nice representation. But if we break it down for them, then they can actually do it. Okay, first of all, oh yeah, I haven't told you that. We will actually focus on characters. So by characters, I just mean people in a story. So we will not ground the candle or the gifts and all the other stuff we could potentially ground, because arguably these are not so important for the story. Stories are driven by characters, right? They're crucial for the narrative, they drive it forward. They often, in a longer story, I mean, these stories are tiny, but if you have a movie, for example, the characters are really important. They drive your engagement with the story. They embody certain themes. Often the characters, they symbolize something and so on, so they really contribute to the narrative. And if I write a story with characters at its center, then it's just going to be more coherent, more interesting. So that's the justification for not grounding everything, but just grounding the characters. And previous work in visual storytelling hasn't done that. It has overlooked characters, and the stories then lack a human perspective. Sometimes there's vague references like they, the man, and so on. Often state-of-the-art systems also screw up coreference, and here's actually an example. So this is a story without characters, it's just fireworks. Okay. It's fine, but it's not really a story in the sense there's no plot, there's no people doing stuff, there's no events, well, other than fireworks exploding. Or in this case, the characters are really vague. There's a parade going on, the first thing up was a fire truck, man watched on, and so on. So it's true, there's masses of people, but they aren't really characters, so also not a good story. Now this story really has a character. This guy in the suit, he reappears. He's in every image. But this is generated by a state-of-the-art system for the story. We all met up with the men. They walked a lot in the man walking, so this is even ungrammatical. We had a lot of food. I gave a speech. So suddenly it's switching from we to I. Everyone was looking forward to it. Who's everyone? It's just a bunch of people. We got together for pictures. So this is not a very good engaging story, right? And there isn't explicit characters, it's always we, I, the man, stuff like that. So this is hopefully helping to convince you that, yes, characters are important. We want good characters in our stories. Okay, so the goal now is to generate visual stories. So we take 5 images and we make up a story for the images. But in addition to that, we are generating characters that are grounded. They're linked to the visual descriptions, and the coreference should be correct. And this is both a visual coreference, where we identify the same person across images, but also the textual coreference. And the challenge, as I've already mentioned, there isn't really any large annotated data set. The existing VIS data set is just images and text. There's no further annotation. So how do we get this annotation? So we're building on VIST, because it's already there and is widely used in the literature, and we enrich it using a pipeline that automatically generates the annotation. And this is where the LLMs come in, as I mentioned. So we start by generating textual chains, and sorry, I'll start with the visual. Visuals chains, and then textual change, and then coreference between them. And this can get quite large, so we have 40K stories, around 300K unique characters, 520 references. So we're ending up with this sort of representation, and we can then use that to train our models. So how do we do this? So this is a technical bit now. So let's maybe start from the right here. So first of all, we take the images up to point K. So there's 5 images. Let's assume we have seen 2 of these images already. And we find the characters. We just use an object detector, off the shelf, DETR in this case. Object detectors obviously are quite good now. So we find the person category using this object detector. So here, for example. And then we cluster them together. So here we have already clustered these 3 occurrences of this character. And this is a singleton cluster. This is a cluster with 2 characters. This is another singleton character. And then a new image comes in. Again, we find all the persons using an object detector. And then we compute similarity between these new characters, or their pixels, really, and the clusters that we already have. And we use a standard mapping algorithm called the Hungarian algorithm to map the new characters optimally onto the existing characters. And so we add them to our set of characters. And we keep going until we've processed all the images. So we could, of course, just do simple clustering, I don't know, k-means or something like that. But the disadvantage is, A, we don't know the k, right? We don't know how many clusters, whereas in this algorithm, we just incrementally add things to our clusters. And the second problem is that this is actually a problem more to do with the detector. So this works really well if characters are not at frontal view. So for example, this character is a side view. Face detectors and face tracking algorithms, which of course exist, they find it really hard to deal with people depicted in a non-frontal view. So that's also why here we cut out larger bits of the character. We don't just cut out the face. To be honest, I think what helps here as well is the fact that we can recognize the clothing, for example. In these short stories, people don't really change their clothing. So it really helps that this boy is always wearing an orange shirt. So that's why it makes sense not to just look at the face, even though obviously there's a separate literature on face tracking and face detection and so on. Okay, so now we have our characters in the images. Now let's look at the characters in the text. So here we just query the LLM directly. So we give it a sentence, we give it the whole story. And in the story we have marked up using Spacey, off the shelf. We've marked up the named entities referring to the named entities. So here all the named entities, Ella, the family, the cake, the chance, and so on. These are all named entities identified by Spacey. And then the LLM is really good at telling us whether it refers to people or not. So whether it's actually a character or not. And then we use the LLM also to do coreference. This is all GPT-4o. We give it then the version of the input, but without the non-person characters. And we ask it to output coreference using this bracket notation. So we use square brackets for the entity boundaries, and we use round brackets for the reference, and hashtags and so on. So this, as you can imagine, took Danyang quite a lot of time to get this right and to find a representation that the LLM will actually deal with. And turns out it's a labeled, or it's a bracket notation like this. And you might wonder, why do we do this? We have coreference algorithms already, of course. Well, we tried them, of course, but it turns out standard coreference models struggle with these plural nouns and collective nouns, like the family. And so the LLM approach was actually more accurate on this task than off-the-shelf coreference. Okay, now we're almost there. We have identified our character chains or character clusters and our chains of referring expressions, pronouns, and so on. And now we put them together. So a chain like Ella and she has to be connected to all the characters labeled for example. And this can be solved by bipartite graph matching. It's a graph matching problem because we have the two graphs, the visual and the textual one. And this algorithm requires a figure of merit. In this case, we're just using similarity to measure the goodness of the matching. And you might ask, so how can we do similarities? Two different modalities. Well, we use clip distance. Clip is a pre-trained multimodal model. And this is actually in previous work we've already shown that this works. And again, Hungarian algorithm is the matching algorithm. Okay, and then you might wonder, does this actually work? So we evaluate this against this small hand-annotated data set that I mentioned that we have already. So we looked at this data set and compared it to the large automatically annotated data set. And here's just a quick table of results of this comparison. So precision and recall for detection. So textual detection works really well. Visual detection, recall is okay. Precision, not so much. Unfortunately, that's just a limitation of the object detector, essentially. Well, and our clustering algorithm. Coreference works reasonably well. It's in the 70s. Textual, it's always easier for text, right? So we get up to the 80s. Multimodal doesn't work at all. So if you try to do this on multimodal representations, it doesn't really work very well. So you're better off doing it on textual and visual representations. And then one quick comparison. There's other data sets, of course. So here is a comparison to our small hand-annotated data set, which is only 700 stories. And the visual writing prompts data set, which is a larger data set that is out there. However, it doesn't contain coreference annotation. And it does contain bounding boxes, but only for the faces. And this is our new data set. So it's automatically annotated, contains full coreference, and is larger than the existing data sets. Okay, so now we have this fantastic data set. What do we do with it? Well, of course, we fine-tune an LLM. Right, that's what you have to do these days. You can try to train a model from scratch, but it's not going to work as well. And we did try. So we fine-tune Otter Llama 7b. So this is obviously is a derivative of llama. And the particular thing about this model is that it is instruction tuned for multi-image understanding. Because most LLMs, at least half a year ago when we did this work, could have changed by now, right? The field is moving very quickly. But half a year ago, there weren't really any models that could deal with multiple images. One image, sure, like the Stuttgart sign, right? You give this to the model, it labels it and so on, that's fine. But multiple images they couldn't handle. And of course you could try to do composite images and stuff like that, but it becomes very messy. And this auto model was the only exception. So this is instruction tuned so that it can deal with image sequences. So we use that as our backbone. The training data is of course the data that we laboriously constructed here using our pipeline. And the task that is being trained is take as an input a sequence where there's visual character and coreference chains overlaid with the numeric labels, so just the way we've seen this, and the output is a story. So the model gets this as an input, including the nice, colorful, and numeric markup, and it needs to generate that. So not just the story, but also the coreference and the correct grounding here, the colorful numbers here. So that's the task. And we're going to evaluate everything. We're going to evaluate the stories, we're going to evaluate the grounding, we're going to evaluate the characters, and so on. Yeah, so unfortunately, standard metrics, people in this field, they just use Blue and Rouge and Meteor and text generation metrics, which of course don't care about grounding. They really don't care about characters, right? If you measure Blue or Rouge, then if you get candle correct, then it's just as good as getting a character correct. So we are reporting all this in the paper, but they're not really interesting measures. So I will focus on a bunch of new measures, namely that measure character richness and coreference consistency. And then, right, nobody does human judgments anymore, right? Everyone uses LLMs as a judge for their evaluation. So this is what we're going to do here as well. And there's a justification. We actually compare it to human judges and so on. I'll come to that. So 2 things. First, look at the characters and the references. Then check whether we're actually generating good stories and people like those stories. Okay, yeah, I'll come back to that. These are the criteria that the judges, both the human and LLM judges, used. Okay, so first metric. This is a metric which just counts the number of characters, here in blue, the number of character mentions, right? A single character can, of course, be mentioned multiple times, and then counts coreference just using b cubed, which is a standard coreference metric in yellow. And here, yeah, so we have a bunch of models. These are 2 models from the literature, state-of-the-art models, including our own previous work. This is S-Otter, which we call our model without grounding. And this is S-Otter++, which is a model with grounding. So it's an interesting comparison whether grounding actually makes a difference. This is GPT-4v, which is a visual version of GPT-4. And this is the gold annotation we're comparing to. Okay, so let's look at the number of characters in blue. Okay, this previous work doesn't generate a lot of characters. It's a little bit more. We generate more characters. But if we ground them explicitly, then the model is more willing to generate characters and has a similar number of characters to the gold annotation. GPT has even more characters, but it has more of everything, as we'll see in a moment. Then same for mentions, not enough character mentions, slightly more, similar number of character mentions as in the gold. GPT extra generates extra mentions. And then here for yellow, we just want to be better. So coreference is not really a strong point of existing work. Not surprising, perhaps, because they didn't focus on this. But we do much better on coreference, and if we ground, we do even better. In fact, we beat GPT-4. We're below human coreference accuracy. Okay, so that's one aspect. Do we generate a good number of characters? Do we get our references, our coreference correct? And then the second aspect is, are the stories any good? And we have human evaluation coming up, or humans model-supported human evaluation. But also there's automatic metrics. So we have a diversity metric, where lower is better. Diversity means that the stories are not generic, but they relate to the images. So diversity means that you actually generate a different story for each sequence of images. So lower is better. This is the state of the art. So we're lower on the blue metric. GPT is even better in diversity. Gold is somewhere in the middle. This is Grovist, which is a grounding metric that has recently been proposed. It uses the clip score to ground the 2 modalities. And here, existing models are not so good at grounding. This blueprint model is actually slightly better, but Otter and Otter++ are better at grounding, even better than GPT-4. The gold one is even better. And then finally, MOV is a measure of how human-like the text is. And here we're worse than existing work, but we're still better than GPT-4. So what's going on with GPT-4? It's maybe worth dwelling on that a little bit. And if you've used the system, then this will seem familiar. So it just generates, so we improve diversity. It generates very long stories. So here I have S-Otter++, which is our model, GPT-4v, and gold in terms of how many words there are in a story. We generate around 50 words. The gold stories have around 50 words. How difficult are the stories? And here we've used the standard reading difficulty index. They're around 5. So lower is less difficult. Gold stories are around 5. GPT is off the charts. It has almost 120 words in a story. And it's actually very hard to get this down, even with clever prompting. And the stories are much more difficult and complicated. Because it likes to use rare words, it likes to produce long sentences, it uses florid language, it just does its own thing when it comes to storytelling, right? Whereas our model, of course, is fine-tuned to generate stories that are similar to the gold standard stories. Okay, but let's now quickly talk about judging these stories. And we do side-by-side comparison, which means that we take a story generated by our model compared to a story generated by a competitor, either another version of our model or a model from the literature. And we judge specificity, which means how specific is the story relative to the images, rather than being generic and talking about the man in the market and so on. Is it coherent? Do you feel engaged? So basically, is it an interesting story that you would like to read? Is it well-grounded? So the characters are actually things that appear in the images rather than being hallucinated. And are there good characters in the story? And then overall quality. And yeah, so I'm glossing over this quite quickly. So this is, we compared the accuracy of GPT-4o judgments, where we give the model a story and ask it to judge these characters, these criteria. Obviously, we give it a definition of those criteria as well. And then we compared it against human judgments. And as you can see, we're doing pretty well. We're sort of in the mid-70s to low 80s in terms of correlating with human judgments. So we just went ahead and used the LLM for evaluation. And then this is the evaluation of Otter++, which is our model with the grounding, compared to iterative blueprint, which is from the literature, Otter without the grounding, and human-generated stories. So as you can see, we easily, so this is how often now do we beat the other model. So we easily beat the blue model, the iterative blueprint from the literature. We also beat our own model without grounding most of the time, in particular when it comes to characters and overall quality. And we don't beat the human stories. Well, here we're at the same, we're on a par with the human stories, which is great. But the human stories are still better most of the time. Okay, so some examples of what the stories actually look like. So these are the two systems from the literature. MCSM says things like, today was females, first day of the school. So the system doesn't really generate characters. It just has these labels. And of course, there's no coreference, so we don't know if it's the same female that's being referred to here all the time. This is iterative blueprint. The oldest daughter is being present for a birthday party. Children decided to walk through the neighborhood. They're actually going to school, right? So the model got this wrong. This is our model. So as you can see, we're generating referring expressions like my little girl. We're indexing it here with she, her, and so on. Her friends is also grounded. We is grounded to 2 characters, 1 and 4. And the story overall makes a lot of sense. So it's first day of school, and there's friends, and there's a brother, and so on. So it's a pretty good story. This is GPT-4, and it does what I warned you. It is just sort of blathering on and on. Ro and her younger brother prepared excitedly for the first day of preschool. Why is it preschool? We don't know. Packing her favorite blue backpack, despite the rain, blah, blah, blah. Sharing an umbrella, keeping the spirits high. So it is really trying very hard to please, to have all these interesting things like blue umbrella, keeping the spirits high, and so on. But it is very different from the human ground truth. much longer sentences, many more adverbs and adjectives, more complicated, longer, and so on. So this is why GPT doesn't do very well in the evaluation. Okay, so that is the first half of the talk. How much time do I have left?
20, 25 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So the second part, really, we're trying something similar but for video. So this part will be more high level because the method is very similar to what we did in the first half, but I will talk about what happens if you move to a different modality, namely videos rather than images, and a different domain, because these are is an instructional domain, basically cooking, rather than stories that people make up about photographs. Okay. So hopefully I've convinced you that grounding is useful when we're generating stories. But what about other domains? Some of them don't even have characters. And if you think about the cooking domain, there's no characters. All right, so in instructional domain specifically. So we have other things like ingredients, implements, procedures. All of these things would be important to recognize. We have a lot more visual information. These videos are, wow, what people call long in computer vision. They're about 2 minutes. Action recognition is done on 20-second clips, right? So in computer vision, people often work with short videos. So they're quite long, so there's more visual information. A lot of the information is left implicit, and I'll convince you of that hopefully in a moment. And then there's other stuff going on. The ingredients are not stable, right? They change over time. You chop stuff, you cook stuff. It changes color, it changes shape, you merge ingredients, and so on. So the characters, if you want to call it that, are actually quite complicated. And Anil is working at this is working on this at the moment. So I won't talk about it yet, but he's interested in what happens when the reference actually change over time. And here we're actually going to focus on the implicit information here, the third bullet point. Okay, here's our video. And we've seen the first part already. In this data set, which is called the UCook2 data set, we have a video, but we also have step descriptions. So the video is segmented into different procedure steps, and then there's a description here. So the first step just says, brush olive oil on a pita bread. Then this is the second step, which I've already shown you earlier. Cook and cut it into cubes. And then it goes on, combine olive oil, lemon, garlic, and salt in a ball, add cucumber, lettuce, and so on. And then you combine it everything and you toss it and you have a salad. So this is a really simple recipe. There's only 6 steps. But there's actually quite a lot of interesting thing going on. So let's break this down a bit. So first of all, coreference makes another appearance, right? Here it says cook and cut it into cubes. So we need to figure out what it refers to. Must be the pita bread, right? Except things are slightly more complicated because it's not just the pita bread. The oil is also involved because we've brushed it onto the pita bread. So there's anaphors, just like in our stories. Maybe not super surprising. But why is the video there? Well, because sometimes there's ambiguity. So step 3 is combine olive oil, lemon, garlic, and salt into a ball. Add cucumber, lettuce, and onion to ball. Turns out these are 2 different balls. Right? The dressing goes into the small ball, and the salad is put into the large ball. The text doesn't tell us that. This is information we can get from the video, though. So, you know, you might wonder, why do we do this in a multimodal setting? It's because of cases like that. Then there's a lot of ellipses, a lot of stuff that's left out. So add dressing and the bread. So dressing, first of all, this is another interesting coreference, right? Because the dressing refers to this thing we did up here. It's not called dressing. It doesn't say make the dressing by combining. No, we need to figure out the dressing refers to those ingredients that are now combined. But secondly, it doesn't tell us what to add this to, we need to go to the previous step and figure out that this ball, which is the second ball, the big ball, now has cucumbers, lettuce, and tomatoes in it, and we add the dressing and the bread to that. The bread is from even further up here, right? We also need to figure out that that's the same bread. And then we toss the salad. Salad? We didn't know we're making a salad, so this is also the first time this is being referred to as salad. Right? So in a simple recipe like this, there's a lot of stuff going on, and I won't be able to solve all of this today. We will focus on implicit arguments. Okay, so here, this is the algorithm. It's really simple. Identify the implicit entities, transform them into semantic roles. Yeah, semantic roles are back. So people have forgotten about them for 5 years, 10 years. But it turns out for a task like this, where you have to identify implicit arguments, semantic roles are really useful. They also make your evaluation much easier, and so on. So we are reintroducing semantic roles. Okay, so how does this look like? Let's just first look at step 1 and step 2. First one, remember, we brush the olive oil, and then we fry it in the second step, and then we cut it. So the second step really is 2 steps, which is another potential problem. Okay, so first step, nothing is going on. Brush olive oil on the pita bread, nothing implicit, no anaphors, anything. But here we're starting with an implicit argument. Cut it into cubes. We need to know that this is the pita bread with the olive oil. So our task will be to put this information back into the text that whoever wrote this text has omitted. And this goes on. So these are the next 3 steps. And here, for example, we need to know that we are actually cooking and cutting the combination of olive oil and pita bread. Actually, cooking also has implicit arguments, which I've left out here, but cutting has those implicit arguments. Here, for example, in step 5, we need to know that we add the olive oil, the lemon, garlic, salt to and the other olive oil, which is on the pita bread, together with the pita bread, to the cucumber, lettuce, tomato, onion, to the salad ingredients. Okay, so sometimes there's quite a lot of implicit arguments that are missing. So ultimately, we want to turn this into a representation which has simple semantic roles consisting of a verb, a what argument, and a where with argument. So what are we doing the action on, and where is it happening, or with which other ingredient is it happening? And so this looks like this. And it's really not super complicated. So we have our verb here, brush. We have our what, the olive oil. And we have the pita bread, which is where the olive oil ends up. Step 2, we need to break into 2 steps. We have 2 verbs, so we know that we need to break it down. First, we cook the olive oil and pita bread. There's no where with, so we have this empty set. Cut, same. Then we combine these 3 ingredients. We add cucumber, lettuce, and tomato. And then here we combine this sequence of ingredients with that sequence of ingredients. And then we toss everything. Okay, so our task is now to reconstruct these semantic roles. And as I said, the methodology that we're using is very similar to the one we've seen in the first half of the talk. We basically automatically annotate a data set, and then we use this to fine-tune an existing language and vision model. By automatically, I mean within LLM. Okay, so the data set we end up is smaller this time. It has 231 recipes, multimodal cooking procedures officially. Duration, as I said, is about 2 minutes on average, about 7.5 steps per recipe. And we also counted the number of implicit entities, and there's quite a lot for both roles, the what role and the where role. There's between 4 and 5 implicit arguments per recipe. Okay, so how does it work? So we have our sequence of instructions, and we have our video. The video is already pre-segmented into steps, so we can extract frames from those steps easily. We have a multimodal language model, multimodal large model, and we turn it into this. Okay, And here I will spare you the details, but essentially this is a combination of Quen, which is a multimodal model, and an LLM like GPT-4o to identify the semantic roles. And how well does this work? So we use this procedure now to predict the implicit arguments, right? We have this data set, which we've generated. We now fine-tune our model to predict, to output the implicit arguments. And this is now the evaluation of that. Look first at text only. So obviously you can do this from the text to some extent. Sometimes people cook without any pictures, right? They just have a written recipe. So it's definitely possible. This is the models we're comparing to. This is Quen, just off the shelf, without any fine-tuning. And this is GPT-4o again. And yes, it can find the what argument 60% of the time. Quen is the smaller model, it's worse. But implicit arguments are harder. And for Quen, they're really, really hard. And this is our model, which we call ISRL. And the base model is Quen 2, so that's why it's ISRL Quen 2. And it does better, not quite as good as GPT-4o on the explicit arguments, right in blue. But it definitely does a lot better on the implicit arguments than both of the models. So does it work for video as well? This is, of course, a harder task. Now we don't have any text. We just give the model the video and hope it will figure out the arguments. So overall performance is lower, both for GPT and for Quen 2 VL, which is a version of Quen 2. In fact, really quite low. And then this is our model, which is fine-tuned on the data set. And we can see, first of all, performance on explicit argument goes up quite a lot. Not quite as good as GPT, but in particular, the implied arguments, the implicit arguments, are on a par with the explicit ones. And this is just from video, right? We don't have any text to identify the arguments by. And then, of course, we can put the two together. This is for text and video. And what we can see, the two existing models, the two off-the-shelf models, they do worse on the implicit arguments again, both GPT and Quen, whereas we get a performance that is a lot higher on the implicit arguments. And overall, we're at a par with GPT for the text. This is multimodal. Also, it's reassuring that multimodal actually works better than either video alone or text alone. Not much better than text, but a little bit better than text, right, if you compare this and this. This is not always the case, right, because on some multimodal tasks, you can really do the task without looking at the pictures or videos. So here we're doing somewhat better if we have the video. Okay, I have another task. So this is a task that is used quite a lot in the instruction video understanding literature, where people say, okay, give me a partial instruction up to a certain step, and then please predict the next step. So we try to do this as well. So the task now is we take an input sequence, which again can be either a textual sequence of steps or can be a sequence of steps in the video. We assume also that we have the semantic roles, right? Because we have shown that we can generate semantic roles in the previous task. And then what we need to do is predict, again using a multimodal LLM, we predict the next step, so step 4. So for that, you basically, need to know which ingredients you would possibly use next, and also what verb you would, what action you would apply to those ingredients. Okay, so, and then we compare this, of course, to the correct step, which we have. And we generate both the description of the step, just a textual description, and we generate the semantic roles as well. This has the advantage that we can figure out where the errors are, right? Do we get the verb incorrect? Do we get the where argument or the what argument incorrect? So this is where SRL is interesting for evaluation as well. So how well does this work? Well, it sort of works. So this is again for text. oops. G-span is Jepsen is a model from the literature for next step prediction. And so we don't have the blue bar because the blue bar is the semantic role. This model doesn't predict the semantic roles. But we have B4 and Meteor. These are these horrible text generation metrics that I mentioned. So B4 is blue, n-gram length 4, and Meteor is another one of these text generation measures. So we see how well this model is doing. For blue, it's not doing very well. For Meteor, it's okay-ish. This is GPT, much better on semantic role prediction, much better on text, and for both B and Meteor. This is Quen, smaller model, still doing okay, not so much on the semantic role. And this is us, and so we're doing really well on the semantic roles. We're doing better on the text, and we get a slight improvement in Meteor as well. Then for video, we're looking at the same things. So GPT does actually do really well here on the roles, predicting the next role. It's a bit worse on blue, but Meteor is also good. This is Quen, and this is our model, where we don't quite manage to beat GPT except for B4. And this is then multimodal, where we have both modalities. And GPT does, again, well. We're doing slightly better on Meteor, and other than that, we're sort of at the same level, which is good because we're based on Quen, which is a much smaller model. Quen is 7 billion. GPT-4 is who knows how many billion, right? Probably hundreds of billions of parameters. Okay, that's it. To wrap up, so we've talked about grounding a lot, and in the first part of the talk, I've talked about grounding in visual stories. I've introduced the VIS++ dataset, which is the result of an automated pipeline that grounds the characters in stories, both in the image and in the text. And we've used this to fine-tune a vision and language model, and we were able to show that this results in nicely grounded stories. They're diverse, they have better coreference than existing systems, and they do well in an LLM as a judge evaluation. And then in the second part, we looked at entities, can't really call them characters, in instructional videos. This time we didn't explicitly ground them, right? We didn't draw a box around the pita bread and stuff like this, but we at least identified the entities that are used in every step. And this was interesting because in recipes there's a lot of implicit entities. Things are just being inferred from the context or assumed or inferred from the video perhaps. So we identified these implicit entities, we put them into semantic roles to be able to better process them and also to evaluate them. These could potentially be fed to an automated system like a robot and so on. And we looked at the semantic roles, but we also looked at next step prediction. And there we also evaluate the descriptions, not just the roles. And that's me. Any questions? Thank you.
Just a second. Splashy.
You better hold it.
I will do. Anyway, thanks for the exciting talk. I would like to impose an IMS idea of asking question order. We typically first invite all master and PhD students to ask the questions, and then we invite everyone else, so the more seniors. And this has turned out to work very well. So, first of all, please, questions from master and PhD.
That's a great idea, yeah. Any students?
Hello, thanks for your interesting talk. I have one question regarding the first experiment. You said you also tested the workflow with GPT, and answers were hard to read. It was blown up into context. I was asking myself, what exactly is the metric for the reading complexity, and what might exhaustive, and how high is the influence of prompting strategies to the exhaustiveness of the answer?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's actually one that the reviewer asked as well. So the reviewer said, well, can't you just get a better prompt so that GPT doesn't produce so much verbiage? And we tried, and we got it down to some extent, but our hypothesis is that the instruction tuning in the model is such that stories like this are preferred, that are flowery, that have a lot of nice adjectives and unknown words and so on. So that's, and this might be different, I don't know. Claude, for example, is not known for its flowery language. So we could have compared against Claude and hopefully would have done better. It also depends on how good the multimodal component is, right? So for GPT, the multimodal component is really good. For Claude, yeah, this is something we haven't tested. And there's a dozen different models to try. To answer the first part of your question, which was how do you measure complexity? So there's actually a small literature on how to measure reading difficulty, maybe mostly for instructional texts. So this is the Kincaid-Flesch reading index, which is very primitive. It measures length of sentences, word frequency, length of words, things like that. But it turns out that this correlates quite well with human reading ability. And the numbers we see are actually supposed to be grade level. So if it's a 5, then someone in a child in 5th grade is supposed to be able to read it. If it's a 12, then that would be, someone at the end of high school and so on. So that's how we operationalize that.
Right. Okay. So recommendation would be to use smaller models to get a more precise
Yeah,
answer.
that would be all models that are instruction tuned in a different way, because I'm sure it's not naturally. It's somehow been trained on storytelling, and we don't even know which data sets it has seen and so on. Obviously, he has ingested a lot of literature, right? Whole Project Gutenberg and so on, with a lot of novels. So it could come. We don't know because we don't know what the model is trained on.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, also regarding the first project, you said that you were trying to align the two chains that you extracted from text and from vision. And in the table you have on the right, you also have multimodal. And there was a short comment that you wouldn't recommend using multimodal.
Yeah, I'm taking this back. Sorry, please finish your question.
Yeah, first, my question is, what is this multimodal embedding? Because you either have visual or textual. What do you mean by multimodal here? What did you compare?
Yes, I'm a bit stumped by this question. I think this is actually so this must be the quality of the multimodal alignment. Yes, sorry. So I told you the wrong thing. So what we see here is this is just detection and coreference for the visual side and for the textual side. Then on multimodal, we don't do detection anymore, but we can still measure the coreference, which in this case means how correctly are the two chains aligned. So, and as you can see, this is quite hard. So this doesn't work as well as just doing the chains for the individual modalities.
Okay, I think I understand now. So this is after the chains have been merged.
Yeah, this is essentially the third step here, where we're linking the two chains, the character chain and the visual reference chain.
So there's still a lot to do on that part.
Yeah, and it has to do, I mean, we haven't looked at this in a lot of detail, but for example, the plural reference are quite hard, and things like group reference, like the family and so on. These are really hard to get right, because on the visual side, it's really, how do you know that these people form a group? Maybe if they're close together, spatially, in the text, there might be information, that is, if it's talking about brothers and sisters and so on, then yes, you can refer to that to siblings or the family and so on. So in previous work, we actually excluded group reference and plural reference for that reason, but they occur quite a lot in stories, so we put them back in, but I think it makes the task quite a lot harder. So that could be part of the explanation why the performance isn't as high as you would like.
Yeah, I can see it. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I have a follow-up question on the first step, I guess, the clustering of characters. What features do you use to cluster?
Yes. So if you use a detector like data, then you basically get a feature vector for a region or whatever you give it. You can think of it as an embedding.
Yeah, so it's probably the average of like the
Yeah, so here for a cluster, we take the average of the embeddings for the individual instances. Yeah.
Okay. And then I was wondering if, so in your data set that you create, you mark the characters, right, in the images.
Mm-hmm.
So would this whole thing also work on sets of images that don't have these markings?
That is sort of our baseline model, the one without the grounding. Right there, we don't use the markings, and we don't generate the grounding and the coreference and so on. So that is sort of the ablation case.
But you could use your system or your pipeline to generate the segmentations and then feed the segmented set of images into the LLM.
Yeah, that's a good question. So you're saying instead of just giving it the images, we should give the LLM the segmentation as well. Yeah, I'm not sure if we've tried this. Probably we've tried this. I can try to look it up. But yeah, it would be an obvious baseline. You're right.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have a question for the last part
Mm-hmm.
with the cooking instruction videos. So first, the semantic roles that you brought back, I think they included verb, what, yes, then, and where, with. So from those examples that you've depicted, the pita bread got the role of where and with, but you left out the bowl in one step instead
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
Could you explain how you define that role of where and with?
Yeah, so this was just a design decision basically to only include stuff that's mentioned in the recipe. So in this case, the ball is not mentioned. If it was mentioned, then it would get the where role.
Okay.
Because the annotation, the semantic role annotation was ultimately based on the text, right? I mean, we have a version where the model also looks at the video, and this is good for ambiguity, like in this case there's two balls, but it is really sort of a text-based task, so we decided to restrict it that way.
Okay, so more in the focus on the ingredients and not the instruments. Okay. And
Yeah, the instruments, if they were mentioned, then we would also.
yeah, that would be like the second question that I have,
Mhm.
because very often in those instructions, like videos and text, the instruments that you have to use, they are not mentioned in the text. So you've really focused on the things that were given in the text.
Yes,
and not-
only those can be role fillers.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's also, so for full disclosure, important to say that this is not an actual recipe. So this is, the data set was created slightly differently. People, this is not our data set, but that's what they did. They took the video, segmented it into steps, and then asked the annotators to generate a step description for each step. So it wasn't that there was a recipe that was aligned with the video in some way, but the step descriptions were generated separately. The annotators had access to the video and to a narration, right? Often in these cooking videos, someone talks about what they're doing, which is a lot more words than this. So the annotators compressed this into basically these short steps. So it's slightly different from conventional recipes.
Okay, I guess we can invite now the oldest people.
Non-students.
12 questions. I have to start with some
One.
anecdote thing before asking my real
Please.
questions. Do you remember 31 years ago when we were both in Edinburgh in the
I
master
know.
program, our project in computational semantics was to build a prolog parser for recipes.
I do remember.
Ground them in knowledge representations. That's so cool. Right?
Yes, I have come full circle. This is actually Robert Dale's task. He invented that task, I think, and in the context of NLG, where also the task was sometimes formulated as you have a knowledge representation and you generate the recipe from there. So people didn't do any videos at that point, but they used knowledge representations, they used instructional text like this. Yeah.
Right. So my serious question is actually a cognitive science question a little bit. So I mean, one thing that I'm often observing when we're looking at what the LLM is doing is we're so schizophrenic. One day we're complaining about them being too inventive, the next day, so we're calling it hallucinations, but what you're after is kind of inventing a little bit around these stories. So I mean, if you give me these 5 pictures of the fireworks, I wouldn't be able to tell you a story that goes by your standards.
That sense it's not a good example.
So,
yeah.
And I actually, so my questions are fortunately a little complicated. My impression is that the narrow definition of grounding that you're using, which is really rather applied, right? So you have a picture, so you have a text and a picture, you try to link them up. Whereas in cognitive science or philosophy of language, grounding is basically a disposition that we have at conceptual level to be able to kind of link things up. I know what a bird is, and then something comes along, I'm not sure, is it a bird, and so on, I will do that. And my question now is, since the models are getting so strong, whether we should slightly move away from this very narrow notion, and that would give us basically kind of maybe more insights in what they are already capable of doing, because they could actually fail for a different reason. They may have the grounding at a conceptual level.
Yeah.
So my question is, would you agree that we should move away from these kind of conditional tasks? You have something, also now you gave away how this was generated. It's also not what typically people who have a kind of visual and linguistic competence, they would basically have in mind how they would do their salad, and then they would tell the story step by step. So you basically try to have tasks more along these lines, right? Do you agree?
Yeah, no, these are all good points. And maybe for the first point, we've actually been grappling with that because what makes a story a story? There's an element of creativity, right? It has to be, it's unfair to call it hallucination, but it has to add something, right? If it's just talking about what's in the image, then it's an image description, right? It might be useful for visually impaired people who can't see the image, but for someone who sees the image or images, they want something extra, right? When they listen to a story or read a story. And so we have come up, and we haven't really published that or anything. We've come up with the following idea to distinguish hallucinations, which do happen quite a lot, right? So GPT also makes things up that are not in the image, right? It's talking about an umbrella when there is no umbrella, it's talking about a girl when it's a boy, and so on. So we need to distinguish that from the actual creative stuff, right? When it sees the umbrella, but then it tells something about the background of the umbrella, or that the umbrella is very, you know, the character really loves the umbrella or bought the umbrella, or it's a souvenir of some kind. So it makes up information that is in addition to what you can see, but doesn't contradict it necessarily. So what you could do is you can see if something is grounded or not. If it's not grounded, then you check whether it contradicts the image or not. And if it doesn't contradict the image, then it's creative in the sense that it adds something that is compatible with the image and adds to the story, hopefully, but is not a mistake, right? So then just saying hallucination is no longer enough. We need to distinguish good and bad hallucinations. And this, I don't think anyone has done that yet.
Thank you for the talk. Coming back to the previous question, so to the technical question again. So you said that you look when doing semantic labeling you also did look into the images or videos. What do you mean by that? Or did you, because there exists a similar task for visual, so for semantic role, visual semantic role labeling or grounded situation recognition. So did you look into
Yeah.
that specifically? And if you did not follow up on that, why not?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of literature, you're perfectly right. So there's the Mark Yatska stuff on visual semantic frames, I think he calls it. There is obviously quite a lot of work on semantic roles and coreference in the textual domain. Michael Roth, for example, has some work. None of these. Oh, Michael's work, I think, deals with implicit argument, but on the visual side, nobody deals with implicit arguments. So that was sort of the limitation, I think.
Okay, I'm referring specifically to, for example, this goal point where you would get the reference from the videos if you align basically the two structures, so the two structures from visual situation recognition or grounded situation recognition and semantic role labeling from text.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. So
No, that's a good point. That means doing basically full grounding, and which at this point was too hard for us. But if you did proper SRL on the video, proper SRL on the text, maybe the implicit arguments are mainly a problem for the text, I'm not sure. And then you align the two, then yeah, you solve the whole problem. Basically similar to what happened in the first part of the talk. But yeah, we're not quite there yet, unfortunately.
Just to follow up to an answer you gave to the question you had before, when you said the plural and group noun references were so difficult. And I was wondering if this isn't similar to calling like the result of your recipe a salad when that hasn't been mentioned.
Yeah, it's true.
Cross-pollinate there.
Yeah, the two students should talk to each other. Yeah, we haven't thought about it that way, partly because we're not attempting to do explicit grounding, and we're not even doing coreference, right? We're just marking up the implicit arguments. But that would be a logical next step. And also this representation, and someone pointed this out to me, you know, we motivate this by saying, okay, you could give this to a robot. The robot, of course, needs to know about implicit argument, not only about explicit ones. But this is not a good representation for a robot, right? And in fact, you might mess things up by implying that these are all separate ingredients, which they're not. So you need sort of a hierarchical representation for entities where you can combine them, and this list of entities becomes addressing. Then you add this to another list of entities, it becomes a salad, and so you need a more complicated representation ultimately, I think. And in addition to that, there's the problem that the ingredients change as well, right? So this is in this particular domain, in the story domain, hopefully things wouldn't change as much, but in this domain, the ingredients change all the time. So yeah, I mean, in spite of working on this for 30 years, right, there's still all these open problems. Yes.
Comment on the fact that you call them the what role and the where or with role, right? I mean, so are you thinking about of those like in terms of the like modality style agent and patient roles here? I mean, you know, like arguments and I mean like instruments and places together in a sense. And I mean, I guess you know you can just motivate that by saying, okay, for the recipes you typically have one thing you focus on, and then you know like manipulate that with respect to one other thing possibly or a place. The question is, like, this is generalized beyond the particular domain here.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and this is something we thought, of course, about, of course. We decided something generic like the prop bank representation wouldn't be extremely useful here, partly because, for example, there's never any agents, right? The agent is always implicit. And instead we made this up basically for this domain. and we wouldn't claim that it's necessarily generalizes to other domains. Another student is working on assembly videos, and you just put things together and take them apart all the time. So there's only 2 actions really. And again, you would need something fairly specialized, I think, but different. So yeah, unfortunately, it probably doesn't generalize very well.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a good point to stop the formal setup here. Thank the speaker again.
Thank you.